Hello, everybody. I'm going to introduce my special guest today, Sarah Adams. For the audience that doesn't know you, please introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Sarah Adams. I'm a former CIA targeting officer. I'm also the author of a book called Benghazi, Know Thy Enemy, which is a cold case investigation to the 2012 Benghazi attacks. And currently, I work for the U.S. Department of Defense, and I work in research and development efforts.
So, the main thing that people know you from is the Benghazi investigation, which is where the movie 13 Hours came from, and the attacks that happened. So, could you introduce that part of yourself and how that all happened?
Yeah, sure. So I used to serve in Benghazi. I served most of the year in 2012. When the attacks kicked off in September of that year, I had left the morning of the attacks to go to a meeting in Europe. I came back the next day, and then I stayed in Libya till the end of November of 2012 to investigate, obviously, who was involved. A couple years later, I got recruited out of the CIA onto the select committee in Benghazi. That was the one run by Congressman Trey Gowdy. So I served in that committee for a couple years. And then separately, me and Dave Boone Benton, who was featured in 13 Hours, we've done our own investigation into the attack. And we actually identified about 150 of the terrorists at the attack.
So, what was the ultimatum of what happened? What was learned? Right? What exactly what was the ultimatum, I guess? What was the result?
I mean, the main thing, we learned from our investigation, right, was that it was an attack directed by Al Qaeda. So I think what the main lesson learned from it was for us was, hey, we need to share this information correctly when it's happening in real time, right? Like everyone should have known it was Al Qaeda. They shouldn't have heard it 8, 9, 10 years later by people who were personally investigating it. So it's just, being honest about events, whatever those events may be.
How did you find out it was Al Qaeda?
By the terrorists, obviously, we identified in the attacks. So about a third of the terrorists actually were members of Al Qaeda. And then it was the leader of Al Qaeda, who's now deceased. He was killed in Kabul over a year ago. But Dr. Ayman al-Zawahiri, he planned the attack on us.
Right, the one that got assassinated by Joe Biden.
Yeah,
Yeah,
well,
the Biden administration.
well, by the CIA probably, but yes.
Yeah. Well, by the Biden administration,
In
etc.
Kabul,
Yeah.
yes.
Um, so this brings up an interesting question. I had Stephen Giblin on here, and he was one of the guys who originally investigated Osama bin Laden. Former Navy SEAL, member SEAL Team 6. He left before they assassinated him, but he did speak about how Ayman al-Zawahiri was basically Osama bin Laden's right-hand man, right? And from the way you're shaking your head, I'm guessing that's correct. But where is Al-Qaeda now that basically their two biggest leaders have both been deceased? Like, how does that work now?
Yeah, well, one of the things he probably brought up that a lot of people don't realize is Zawahiri was also like his operational deputy. A lot of people look at him as kind of like a religious scholar, and he was really in the weeds on planning things. So with both of them gone, Al Qaeda's actually passed on to the next generation of the Bin Ladens. So Osama bin Laden's son, Hamza bin Laden, now is shepherding, Al Qaeda. He is the figurehead of Al Qaeda.
Is Al-Qaeda still as big? Like, is it still as much of a threat? Because now that the U.S. has moved to the U.S., a lot of people have kind of forgotten about how bad the Taliban and uh, Islamic extremist groups actually are. So, what's the result there now?
Yeah, I think if you would have asked maybe like 4 years ago, I would have said Al Qaeda is probably the smallest it's ever been. But since the fall of Kabul, Al Qaeda now is probably bigger than it was in 2001, and it's growing rapidly with all the training they're able to do in Afghanistan, as you can imagine.
How come it doesn't get as much media coverage?
I think numerous reasons, right? A lot of people, especially in the press, are Afghanistan fatigued, right? They reported on it for 20 years. Even towards the end, they weren't getting the reader counts they wanted. So it's just not the top of news cycles. Also, there is, like with Benghazi, an interest in downplaying Al Qaeda. A part of that is because our government is trying to make some sort of relationship work with the Taliban, and the only way to make relationship work with the Taliban is ignore their relationship with Al-Qaeda and focus on ISIS, right? So unfortunately, it's probably a little more policy than really reality on the ground, sadly.
A lot of people, especially nowadays, and especially considering it's an election year, will kind of go between leaders. And this is a topic I've had with multiple, you know, like Jim DiOrio, former head of the New Jersey FBI, etc. And I recently had Peter Frichelli, former deputy assistant director of the ETF, and I asked both of them about the leadership of the government currently and how that plays into it. And a lot of people always point to Trump or Biden, typically, or any real leader, as to what's going on now with Al Qaeda. So, and like terrorism. So, when it comes to either of them, is there any truth to this guy dealt with it better than that guy?
You know, I don't know if it's about who dealt with it better. I feel like one of the key positions people ignore that probably is the most important is the national security director, right? And both Biden and Trump did not put good people in those roles. And as you can imagine, they both tripped up, or all of them tripped up, because I think a couple went through the Trump administration, and now the current one is Jake Sullivan. So that's kind of who, the national security strategy is pinned on. That's who the president relies on. And if those people are wrong in their assessments, right, because Bolton was one of the ones prior to him, then the president's making wrong decisions, if that makes sense. So I think that's who we should look at. And we've just had one after another of people just not doing that position well, unfortunately. Both sides.
Right. A lot of bad directors have been put in place of different agencies, especially as of recently. There have been good ones, though. But it's not as common. And to that point, actually, what's it called? When you say the national security directors, do you mean as in like the director of the NSA, director of the CIA, all of them?
NSC. So so basically anything like the CIA or NSA does, let's say they want to go get Bin Laden, right? They put requests in, it goes up, and it's approved by basically the National Security Council, right? So basically the National Security Director for the whole United States is the one kind of saying yes or no and blessing those choices and decisions. And so that position, as you can imagine, has a lot of influence and is very important about doing operations correctly and having the right strategy, especially now with so many conflicts going on, right? That has to be aligned properly so you don't misstep here or there.
Right. Well, is any part of the solution, because we've tried, it seems like, assassinating leader after leader between Osama bin Laden and Ayman al-Zawahiri. Um, is that like, I guess, the route that you think the United States should take again, or do you think, like you were saying before, like making a deal of sorts or some type of relationship?
Well, I think one of the successes when you take out senior leaders, I don't focus as much as someone like a Bin Laden, but if you focus on someone who is like a mastermind, right? So Khalid Sheikh Mohammed is a really great example, right? So he was in charge of external ops for Al-Qaeda, right? So he planned 9/11, right? So when you have someone with that type of brain and that type of creativity and that kind of network, they're very dangerous. So taking him off the street and then his replacements did have a positive effect, right? It really did stop major attacks on the homeland. So yeah, if you take out the operational people, you're going to need to, right? I mean, even the individual now who just planned the Hamas attacks, Mohammed Diaf, right? He is successful enough now, he will plan follow-on attacks, if someone does not do something about him. And so you still have to do that. I don't think you should ever negotiate with terrorists. Sadly, Benghazi got overran, as you can imagine, by terrorists. They luckily got pushed out by 2017. But when these locations get taken over by terrorists, I mean, it's just a horrible life for the people, right? They don't get the basic needs. There's no women's rights. I mean, there is just no sort of diversity of any form, right? I mean, they're living in prison. So we don't want anyone to kind of like live under these terrorist groups or even almost terrorist regimes like Iran, right? Like the people of Iran should not be in that position.
So when it comes to for example, like the Taliban, right? And this is is considered a very big failure in, as of recent times in the U.S. government, on a federal and international level, is the removal of the U.S. government from Afghanistan and the Middle East, which ultimately led to the Taliban retaking over the country, right? Just instantaneously. Was that the right course of action in your opinion, or do you think, like, what was the failure there that now has the leader of the Taliban basically as the president of that country?
Yeah, I mean, the failure was, I mean, a withdrawal is fine, right? I do think we should have kept strategic locations like Bagram, but people have different opinions about that, you know? But the problem is, in the 6 months and so prior, we stopped providing resources to our allies there, right? And we had been integrated for 20 years, so they needed our assets to do operations. I mean, even just to fix airplanes, right? They needed our SIGINT platforms. We ran the logistics supplies that moved the weapons around the country. So we basically pulled all that aid from the Afghans. So then obviously they didn't have the tools they needed to fight the Taliban when they emerged. But the bigger issue now is, that's water under the bridge. Sadly, you can't just rewind 3 years and fix it. The problem now, though, is we send so much money to Afghanistan, we're helping enable the Taliban to stay in power. So what I feel, if we want to fix a policy there, we need to stop all funding to Afghanistan and let the Taliban fail.
Right. And with regards to the current leader of the Taliban, I don't remember his name, but
Yeah.
in terms of him, I believe President Trump, while he was still in office, there's a clip going around. It's pretty viral where Sean Hannity's asking him, like, you were on a phone call with the leader of the Taliban. He's like, yeah, I was. Do you know the clip I'm talking about?
Yeah, that was actually, so he's I think like number 3 of the Taliban now, Mullah Abdul Ghani Barater. So he was the head negotiator for the Taliban deal, and Trump said, "Hey, if you go past the red lines, here's your house on a map. I'll blow it basically to smithereens." The crazy part is though, so there are red lines in the contract with the Taliban. Not that I think we ever should have negotiated with the Taliban, not including the Afghan government. That's completely wrong. But the Taliban have broken all those red lines, right? So we did have an opportunity before the withdrawal to end the agreement because they didn't keep their side. But yeah, so that's the famous clip. The sad part is, it's changed so much from that. In the last year, that terrorist, Mullah Barater, his wife was issued a visa by our State Department, and she came to the United States because her sister lives in Virginia. So we went from a president saying, "I'm going to take out your house if you break these rules," to, "Oh, hey, your wife can come visit and shop and hang out in America." So it's gotten like extremely crazy how much leeway we've given the Taliban, unfortunately.
So you're saying that they've effectively been given like a form of diplomacy, like almost like a respect by the United States.
Correct. Yes. Treated almost like you would treat, just, I don't know, the Germans or something.
Right. So what? So you believe that the correct course of action would be to continue to treat them as terrorists?
Yeah, treat them as terrorists and just not have an official relationship with them. And then one other small piece is the US government's current policy is no support to the resistance to the Taliban. So I think they should end that policy and say, hey, we can support resistance to the Taliban if needed or necessary. The resistance to the Taliban isn't asking us for things like boots on the ground. It's type of things, that we've provided to, Ukraine, to Israel, like those type of things, training, maybe some sort of SIGINT platforms, help with weapons. As you can imagine, just getting weapons to the region can be complicated. So I do think the US should support that. And remember, the money they're spending 80 billion every 10 days in Afghanistan. Now, if that money went to a better cause than the Taliban, we wouldn't be like tying the wrists of the people trying to fight them.
Well, because this is something you've been mentioning, is the refusal to effectively negotiate. You think that's the best course of action, but what's the alternative to negotiating? Because when I mentioned like Trump's clip, for example, would that be considered negotiating in your opinion? Because that seems like a very direct. That seems less of negotiating and more of almost like extortion, for lack of a better term, right? Saying like, you do this, I'm going to obliterate you, I'm going to annihilate you, right? I know where you are, etc. So, and a lot of people have a lot of respect for him for that, right? but is that wrong? Is that right? Is that considered negotiating? What is a better alternative?
Yeah, well, the thing is, terrorists will like eat on your weakness, right? So if you don't show strength to them, they'll run all over you. So even Trump's statement's great, right? But when the Taliban broke those agreements, somebody should have done something, right? I'm not saying bomb his family home, of course. I think even the house, I want to say, was in Qatar, so we're not going to bomb it anyway. So it's almost like he made this comment, right? But it wasn't really something we would do. It's just some bravado, right? But the terrorists want to hear that. Like someone like Mutala Berater wants to be talked to like he's powerful, right? So you have to kind of keep that in mind. It's a very, very different mindset. They aren't going to view it in the way that you would feel like, oh, this is an intimidation tactic or something, because they would do it the same way back. It's a strongman thing.
Almost like parasitic, like they feed off of like any ounce of weakness or lack of leadership.
Right. So you got to do the reverse.
Yeah, because the way that you're explaining is almost like a very extreme mafia of
Yes.
sorts.
That's a really
Right.
good example. Yes.
Yeah. Right. Well, switching away now from Islamic terrorists, you're currently working now on an organization in Ukraine and Ukrainian relief efforts. What does that look like? How does that work?
Yeah, I mean, it's really very simple. Just going back to Afghanistan, a lot of Americans got involved in withdrawal from Afghanistan. We're rescuing their interpreters, for example. So in January of what is it now, 2021, all the dates come together, or is it 2022? Anyway, I got reached out to and said, hey, the Russians have built up all these people, on the border. The assessment is they're going to go in. We have to start moving evacuation teams in. So if the Russians come in, we got to get people, out to safety, be it obviously vulnerable populations in Ukraine. The biggest one is a lot of people don't understand is Ukraine's one of the countries with the largest number of like orphans and orphanages, right? So obviously you don't want them to fall into, nefarious hands, criminal hands, terrorist hands, and get the children trafficked or something. So that was kind of one of the big focuses. The other focus was, as you can imagine, just different nationalities in the country. So yeah, we put together evacuation teams, and then in February of that year, we started evacuations out of Ukraine.
So do you cooperate with the government? Like, how does that work?
Yeah, so you basically, to operate in Ukraine, you can't like go into like a province or how a state would be here and just do whatever you want. You basically get approvals from the government, and then they give you like a certificate saying, hey, this is a vetted organization, they can be here. So we just do humanitarian, if that makes sense. So we don't link up and like we don't have Ukrainian military or something, if that makes sense. So we just have approvals to do humanitarian aid, humanitarian relief, move those type of supplies around, and that's what we do. And yes, it's fully approved by the government there, and by, as you can imagine, other international organizations, because it's a pretty tight network in Ukraine, and because it's a war zone, you have to kind of watch each other's backs, right? Because you don't want to make mistakes and get, humanitarians targeted, or have the Russians think you're not doing a humanitarian mission, right? Because it could put other people at risk.
So this is like, is what you're doing seen as problematic by Russia?
Russia, I believe so, because Russia has targeted, unfortunately, some aid workers in our network. They unfortunately killed a very famous French aid worker in our network last spring, and we believe it was a direct target on her vehicle. It wasn't an accidental, this occurs in a war zone type of thing. So they have targeted some of the humanitarians. They've also doxed some humanitarians online, on like Telegram and stuff, and have lied and said that they're like private military contractors, or, that they're undercover, and, whatever, theory they want to put out there. So they have been very active about even going after the humanitarian workers.
So when it comes to what's it called, being I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought for a second. I got a call.
Right.
But I was gonna say that when it comes to the humanitarian workers that are getting targeted, right, by the Russian government. So like how do they find out, right? Like who's the humanitarian workers? Is this like online information, and or like how does that work? Is this just like their form of like the NSA, CIA, like the FSB? Like where is this intelligence coming from, basically?
Sure. If I broke it down into what I think is the two main areas, yes, they have, as you can imagine, good phone collect, right? If you remember early in the war, actually, the Russians watched a bunch of European volunteers come in and co-locate at a camp, and then they hit it and killed over 100 people. But they also, what a lot of people forget is inside Ukraine, there's a lot of people who want Ukraine to be Russian, right? Or there's Russian sympathizers, or there's people who had lived in Russia and now they're in Ukraine. So Russia has a very powerful source network of sympathizers, right? And I feel like it's almost like human, for example, is where they're getting their best info.
Right. So effectively like support groups, almost kind of like right-wing extremist organizations or left-wing extremist organizations like here in the United States, where it's not really like a group like the Taliban. It's more like a network of people that'll sympathize.
Yeah, and maybe people who are more nationalists. So, like a really good example in Pakistan, there's all those Kashmiri terrorist groups, right? Like they attack India, but they're very loyal to the government of Pakistan, right? So they'll share stuff with the government of Pakistan because they're nationalists. So I think that's kind of the way to look at it. So people who love Russia and want to do right by Russia.
Right. So it's not necessarily the government that's doing this.
You mean the Russian government? Yeah, it's people. The people share with the Russian government, right, who are Russian sympathizers, or they are ethnically Russian, or you know what I mean? They support the cause that Russia is fighting.
Right. So, because the Russian government has had a history of being willing to cooperate with people that give it information, right? And not like in the same way with the U.S. government where, like there was a circumstance years ago where on 4chan, I don't know if you're familiar with this, where somebody, I guess, like a I think an Islamic extremist group, um, I don't know where, I don't know the details exactly, but they posted this video on 4chan, basically like a military training for their organization. I guess to, I don't know, round supporters, whatever. And then 4chan tracked them down, um, posted their coordinates and whatever they found it, everything. I don't know. I forget how they did it. I think it was through like electrical towers in the area, and then they coordinated it, and then they found a journalist with ties to Russia who they then messaged and had the place bombed. Is there any reason that the Russian government will work directly with people that they don't even know if they're verifiable sources of information?
Well, you have to remember Russia probably had ways to verify that information, as you can imagine. They have really great technical resources. The other thing too is you have to remember Russia is very proactive against Islamic extremism, terrorist groups. They've been fighting in Syria all these years, right? They're enemies, of ISIS, for example. So they will align and share and do things terrorist related, and I think that confuses a lot of people, right? Because a lot of people also view Russia as terrorists. It's kind of like, I'll work on the issues that matter to my country, right? But we aren't allies, right? Like we're not
The enemy of my
associates.
enemy is my friend.
Yeah, and at times, right, you do have we have some of the same enemies as Russia.
Right. Because I remember I spoke to Scott Duff, the FBI agent, and this was years and years and years ago before things were as geopolitically complicated as they are now. And he was talking about how there was a Russian man a Russian citizen actually, who came to the United States, and he robbed, I don't know what, I think it was a convenience store. And on top of that, he killed his mom while he was in the States. And they used to actually be able to cooperate in terms of law enforcement with the Russian government. Um, and he's like, it might happen now. It's a little bit more complicated, but would that be like a similar circumstance?
Yeah, I mean, think somebody like that, you probably could work with the Russian government, you know what I mean? Because he's a Russian national, there's the family killing. And remember, people don't just go out and do one thing, right? He might have a history. His history might be in Russia, and they actually might be interested in him. And now he messed up here, and they're like, oh, that's what happened to that guy. Or maybe they were following him. And anyway, Russia spends a lot of time, as you can imagine, following people who left their country to see what they're doing.
Right. So, I mean, when it comes to Russia and attack, but back to the point of them targeting different members of even your groups, right? They do it intentionally and targeted to effectively stop relief efforts almost to the Ukraine.
Yeah, I mean, I don't exactly know why Russia does it. I mean, sometimes people just do things because they're evil, right? They just kill a good person to kill a good person. They just torture a good person, right? They just call someone a spy to call them a spy, right? Unfortunately, that's the kind of the name of the game when you're working with irrational actors. But they do, as you can imagine, want to impact any assistance going to citizens, especially in certain areas. You know, when Russia took over different cities, right, they wanted to keep the aid out, as you can imagine, because they wanted to keep their successful offensives going, right? And so the best way to do that is to keep like foreigners out, for example.
Right. Well, I mean, we do have, and I think still now, Edward Snowden, for example, who, blew the whistle on NSA surveillance of the United States and its civilians and international surveillance. And inevitably, he moved to Russia. And there's a lot of people that are like, oh, he's probably being protected by the Russian government. Even Putin himself didn't want to hand over Snowden, right? I think when he was asked about it. And I believe he made an announcement on it. There's a video on YouTube of him doing it. But why did Russia help him, right? Was it like, what was it out of?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think what happened is, Snowden didn't really think through his exit strategy very well. He went to Hong Kong, and then was like hoping to go to Ecuador or something, and then he got stuck in Hong Kong and was like, shoot, the only place I can get a visa and go to is Russia, and kind of got stuck there. And then of course Putin's like, oh, this is really great to take advantage of this, and just kind of stick his finger in the eye of the United States. So like, why ever hand him over? So I think Russia just got lucky because Snowden didn't really have a good plan, and they kind of ended up now with this asset landing on their territory, and now they get to use it to their advantage.
Right. What are your thoughts on Snowden as a whole?
I mean, I think Snowden's a traitor, and I don't think if we ever bring him back to the United States, we should put him through trial and, levy the full sentence against him. A lot of people don't realize is, stuff Snowden released, like really impacted our national security. Like one of the things he released was how we were basically going after terrorists, in the tribal areas of Pakistan, right? Which then changed their methods, and it really prevented us not only from going after them, but we had kidnapped Americans that we were then unable to locate. And it just led to, as you can imagine, a lot of deaths and suicide attacks in Kabul against, our soldiers. So Snowden had a horrible impact on this country, and yeah, he gets no pity from me.
Well, when it comes to a lot of his supporters and a lot of people that will justify what he did, right? And I'm not saying my opinion on him, right? I kind of in between on it. But when it comes to his decision to leak everything, his justification was that it's not right and it violates different amendments, the Bill of Rights, I believe the Ninth Amendment and the First Amendment, to surveil U.S. citizens for the justification of terrorism and national security, right? And even Andrew Bustamante spoke about, him multiple times. But what would be your response to that justification?
So my argument is, and I have seen things wrong in the government, as you can imagine, but there are pathways, right? I know back then there was no whistleblower laws, but every organization has an inspector general. Most of the oversight in Congress, you can reach out to them and have a discussion on anything classified, right? And they can be very proactive about it. So if he had gone down several routes and found no support for the little bit. He was exaggerating, right? Because the collect on Americans was incidental collect, right? You could not then go look at it. You still, if I incidentally collected on you, for example, right? I can't then go see what I collected. Now, if information came in and it's like, oh, he's in this terrorist cell, you know, out of Chicago or something, then you have to go to the FISA court and say, hey, this information came in, he's in the incidental collect. The FISA court makes the ruling if we can look at the data. So it's not like they collect a bunch of data and can actually look at it. It's all kind of like, even your phone number would have like X's at the end. I couldn't even see it, right? So his interpretation of it, in my opinion, was exaggerated. But again, no matter what, when you see something wrong, there are pathways first to explore besides releasing classified information.
Ultimately, though, you consider him as a traitor and someone who has done nothing but wrong for this country, or at least mostly wrong for this country, correct? Okay.
There's the way he did it. He did not do it in a way you would be doing it to protect Americans. He did it in a way that was greedy and egotistical and dangerous.
Right. And this actually leads me into my next question, which would be, what, in terms of the U.S. government, what have you learned about the people that lead our governments, and what around the world, right? Mainly in the U.S., but what have you learned about the people that are the presidents, politicians, you know, directors, whatever? What have you learned about these people? And yeah.
I mean, as I get older, right, I look at things a lot different. I look at how, you know, lots of times we're really funding both sides of conflicts, and that's because sadly conflicts makes these type of people money, right? You know, when you get to the upper echelons of anyone, even like a congressperson, for example, right, you've weeded out a lot of maybe good candidates, you know, just decent human beings, because think about it, you still have to get the party to say, oh yeah, you can bring in 1 million a month to the party, right? Or whatever, and we'll support you as a candidate. So it's like a certain type of person who goes into these roles who can function in that, because I'm sorry, I'm not going to come home every day and go to a fundraiser at night, like shoot me, right? So you get a certain type of person in this role, and I do think it's hurting us. I like in the UK where there's this very, very, very small number for campaign financing. I do think if we had something like that in the United States, it could lead to the better candidates, hopefully, rising up through this muck. But right now, our system, and especially our two-party system, it is broken on both sides.
So effectively lobbying in these people that are, you know, funding different campaigns and deciding where the money goes to the campaigns is problematic.
Oh, yeah. And think about it. Even running for office is a money-making thing, right? Like you could go run and just like make money off of it and know you had no chance of winning. It's like this, it's just this corrupt cesspool that, you know, it just doesn't get anyone excited, right, about the democracy aspect of it.
Absolutely. I feel like politics in general, it wasn't the same after the 2016 election, I feel like, in my opinion.
Yeah,
Like,
I feel for a long time it's been just a very divided, negative thing. I mean, even when I joined Congress, I joined in 2015. And, you know, at the time I was thinking, what do I want to do with my future? And I would talk to Congress, you know, people and be like, hey, was this a right decision when you ran? And would you do it again? And I got a lot of negative opinions. Like, I never would have done this again. I came into this kind of idealistic. I came in to fix the system. I realized I can't. So this has been a long problem. And as you can imagine, it's like the same people, the same families filtering through our political system. And until that changes and we bring in, I guess, like a new blood, or, you know, even the new generation is the kids of them. Yeah, we're just going to keep a broken system.
right. Now, this is, I mean, you don't have to answer this, but have you ever met any presidents of any countries?
I have met presidents of countries, yes. And then mostly, though, I've met like the heads of like the military or the intelligence agencies, as you can imagine.
Are you okay with sharing the names of any presidents?
Well, I mean, I met a lot of the leaders, as you can imagine, in Libya, because we were in there right after the revolution and they are trying to form a government. the government kept changing over. So obviously we met a lot of people as it became a revolving door. Like the agency doesn't always meet with those people, right? Because we have in most countries established relationships, established pipelines. Here's who we liaison, right? But when you're in those kind of environments where it's just everything's new and you're making all new relationships, CIA in that case was kind of like the leader on the ground, establishing a lot of the relationships.
Right. Well, like even as like someone who worked in Congress, did you ever meet any like currently in the public eye, like senators or individuals?
Well, when I was in Congress, I was with the Benghazi committee. So we had a Republican staff and a Democratic staff. So obviously I knew all the members on our committee. We also brought in, as you can imagine, a lot of senior leaders in the US government as part of our questioning. I mean, most people know, obviously, we brought in Hillary Clinton, for example. So when you're on one of those investigative committees, you do meet a lot more people, like at least focused on your topic, if that makes sense, vice if I was just sitting in office as a staff member. So yeah, I met people, both sides. I mean, they were all kind of the same, if that makes sense, Republican or Democrat. I mean, when I joined Congress, I was actually a Democrat. I'd been a 20-year Democrat at the time. And I oddly got hired by the Republican side of the Benghazi committee, which, as you could imagine, was a huge issue with the Democratic side. Honestly, my time in Congress made me actually leave the Democratic Party because I had just such a bad taste in my mouth for how they actually treated me, because at CIA at the time anyway, we worked pretty apolitically, right? Like I didn't know who my boss voted for. We didn't answer questions based on which congressperson it came from. So it was a big awakening to go there and then have them try to like impact my work in some way just because of what letter I had signed up for on a voting card that I don't even know if I even ever voted really at that time. So.
Right. Well, did you ever, while you were in the CIA, right, while you were working there, right, what would an average day of like work look like for a CIA agent?
Sure. If I was in headquarters, it depended what job I was doing. I was an analyst half my career and I was a targeter half my career. So an analyst, your basic day-to-day job is like you might have your account you're working on. So, if you're the Bin Laden person, you're obviously going through and seeing what new stuff came in on Bin Laden. And then you're answering any questions that came in from policymakers, be it like the president's team for his briefing the next day or Congress people. That's kind of who you answer the questions to. And then the targeting side, you have your portfolio and you're just looking for new pieces of information on your target, or you're looking at new ways to get at your target. It's a lot more like deep dive stuff when you're at headquarters. Obviously, when you're in the field, you're just involved a lot more. You're going to meetings. You could be debriefing detainees. It's like a whole mix of things when you're out in the field. I like being overseas 1,000 times more than at headquarters, but I think that's the view in all of CIA.
Well, when you mentioned the president's team, you did remind me of something with Andrew Bustamante, and I think I was trying to get it out before, but I couldn't remember. With regards to how the president works with intelligence and U.S. intelligence, right? There's kind of like a mix between, he's not really that involved and also he's extremely involved and he can kind of sign off on whatever he wants, right? In your experience, like how does that work between either the president's team, his directors, his staff members, whatever? Like where's the communication?
Sure, I can actually explain because I watched a transition between two presidents and two very, very different personality styles. So my boss had been the CIA's briefer to George Bush, right? George W. Bush, or whatever's the younger one. And he was very he brought CIA everywhere with him. He got briefings all the time. He wanted face to face. He wanted to visually see things. He wanted you to walk him through things. He's super hands-on, right? Almost like he worked there. Then when President Obama came in, he's, a younger generation, right? He's like, hey, get it to me on a tablet, right? Like summarize it in a few pages, drop it off on my desk, right? And so the briefers had spent all this time, right, with Bush, and like, here's how we're going to present this. And then with Obama, they had to be like, okay, how do we do this the best when he's, you know, on the tablet? Like, if he has a question, it's answered in the tablet, right? Because we're not going to be there to answer that follow-up question. So they had to put a lot more thought into what might he think, what might he question, what might he want to know next. And so they had to actually change the whole style they were briefing or providing information to the president. And every president has a completely different way they do things, right? Obviously, I don't know Joe Biden's preference, but he has a completely probably different preference than the last two. And you just always have to change depending on the president.
Right. Like Donald Trump, for example, I've heard that, you know, he really liked visuals as well, kind of similar to Bush, where he preferred pictures usually a lot of times and diagrams.
Yeah. And a lot of ambassadors, luckily, a lot of ambassadors like it that way, and a lot of the military like it that way. So a lot of people do feel comfortable, you know, presenting things in that form too.
Right. So with Bush, though, right? I mean, this was the guy that, you know, president during 9/11, right? Where the need for U.S. intelligence was at an all-time high, right? Where everyone's asking, why did this happen? How could this have happened? Right. Even Osama bin Laden himself, a conversation I had with Stephen Giblin, right? Like, not a very commonly known fact is that he did work for the CIA up until 9/11, right? And in different ways, right? And he had a relationship with the U.S. government. Um, which actually brings up an interesting question of, would that be a prime example of why you shouldn't negotiate with terrorists?
Well, I think we have to like take a step back. So we went in, as you know, and fought the Russians, right? So there was basically 5 main mujahideen groups. So this is before the Taliban. So there's basically 5 main mujahideen groups fighting Russia. And we created, as you can imagine, relationships among those groups, provided supplies, you know, like surface to air missiles, etc. So we had relationships with a number of them. To be honest, I think the bigger concern is somebody like the Haqqanis we were close to, and now that relationship has obviously resurfaced, and we seem close to them again, which is super dangerous. Bin Laden was in those circles, right? But he wasn't running any of those major mujahideen groups. He was spending actually a lot of time living in Peshawar. So he would basically, so we had an American club. So every embassy and consulate has like restaurants on it. Like he would hang out there because remember, he was on our side, right? He wasn't viewed as a terrorist then. He was a freedom fighter. They're fighting the Russians. So he had like exchanges and a relationship that way. But to say like the Bin Laden was like a paid CIA source or something, it's just not true at all. To say it was a continuing and ongoing relationship, that's just also not true. But regardless, when you fight in these battles and you fight with terrorists, it's a problem, right? So obviously fighting with Bin Laden and whomever was a problem, right? In Libya, when we supported the revolution, there were terrorists on the side of the revolution. Now Afghanistan, we supported the Taliban, it's a terrorist. So you should never align with like the terrorists or the Islamist side of things, because at the end of the day, when you get to the end, you want different things and you're just never going to get on the same page, right? We have different ways we live our lives.
This brings up an interesting point of what's it called, of Osama bin Laden's letter to America, right?
Mm-hmm.
It recently kind of went a little bit of viral, right? And you know, a couple months ago, but it still went viral. A bunch of people on TikTok and, you know, somewhat on Instagram I would hear about it, but mainly on TikTok and all these news platforms, they were saying like kids are sympathizing with Osama bin Laden after reading his letter to America, right? And they're like, oh, you'd understand why, you know, if you read his letter, you know, and all this kind of nonsense in my opinion. But what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, the way you have to look at that, and I know the people reading it now don't understand this aspect of it, but that wasn't a letter Bin Laden wrote to America, right? So Bin Laden had an American on his staff, Adam Gadon, and Adam Gadon said, hey, let me make this letter that influences people who could be our sympathizers, right? So Bin Laden didn't write that letter. Adam Gadon wrote that letter. He gross wrote it. Bin Laden signed it. And the sole purpose of it was to influence, but it didn't work, right? And then somehow all these years later, people are reading it like, oh, these are Bin Laden's words. Oh, it makes perfect sense. It's like, no, it was written by an American who knows how to get under your skin and influence you and knows what triggers you. And people have to understand. That's the problem with influence, right? It gets you, that it was written that way to get you.
Right. Almost like like this heartfelt letter from somebody that really doesn't care.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Actually, in my conversation with Steven, I know I'm mentioning him a lot, but that's kind of because it's a very related conversation. With him, when I spoke to him about, I asked him a question of whether or not he thought Osama bin Laden was crazy, I'm sorry, insane, if he was evil, or if he was just insanely just selfish and greedy, right? And his response was that he was just extremely religiously dedicated, right? Because he had all the money he could ever want, so that wasn't the motive. And he had all the power he really like could have wanted through that money, and he ultimately decided that Islamic extremism was his way to go. From your experience of the Bin Laden bloodline, now Hamza bin Laden, is that really remain true?
Yeah, I think they believe in their cause to the death, right? I do believe Bin Laden, actually, his whole view was kind of like to have an Islamic army and bring all the terrorists together and then take over, basically, Western civilization, right? And I think Hamza believes the same. Bin Laden never really got there. But the thing is, when you look at the Abbottabad documents, they're free on CIA's website. Anyone can go through them. You can see Bin Laden is very meticulous, very organized. He cared a lot about building relationships, right? He cared a lot about accountability, right? Everything, right? He was a businessman, right? So he did things in the logical manner, and you have to now know his son is going to do them in the same way, and he's going to put all the puzzle pieces in place to fulfill his father's legacy, and that's what he wants to do. And so we should be very concerned about that, because these aren't crazies, right? They know how to influence. They know what endpoint they want to get to, and they're willing to die for it.
So this brings up a question that I was thinking about a little bit yesterday, and it's also part of the question sheet. But what are some common personality traits of terrorist related people?
You know, I think people try to make personality traits and then they get confused when they're not. I mean, I think the best example, right, is all the ISIS wives. It's like, how did this like blonde girl from Germany like fly to Syria and marry this terrorist, right? Because people want there to be like a set way. 9/11 threw a lot of people off too. Remember, like Muhammad Atta had been at the London School of Economics. ISIS right now, so ISIS Khorasan gets a lot of attention, as you can imagine, because that's who the US and the Taliban are fighting in Afghanistan. But ISIS Khorasan has been extremely effective recruiting Tajiks who are in college. So they're like an engineering program. So ISIS is recruiting guys in engineering programs. Think about that. So I think for a long time, people thought, oh, terrorists are just vulnerable people. Like, you know, they've been ostracized by their government. They don't have the education. But really, anybody can be indoctrinated. And that's the dangerous part, right? And they really like to indoctrinate in schools, in colleges, in those environments, because those are the times you kind of group together, right? It's when you like to join clubs. It's even when people join the military instead of college, right? They like that feeling of being a part of community, and terrorists know that that's the best time to kind of like pull you in.
Right. Now, switching to a topic that I have absolutely no idea what I'm talking about, but I'm guessing you would. So there's a lot of wars going on right now, all of which have a lot of media coverage between Russia, Ukraine, Israel, and Palestine. Mainly the latter of Israel and Palestine. I intentionally don't look into it. I don't have an opinion on it. I know nothing about it other than like the very, very general concept, right, of it starting from like World War II all the way to now. Um, but what are your thoughts on the fact that all these wars are happening almost congruently, like one after the other, and why all of a sudden did Benjamin, I don't want to say his name wrong, the Prime Minister of Israel, why did he suddenly say, I'm going to go to war to Palestine? And like, what is the situation essentially?
Sure. I mean, I think the thing we need to look at is none of this just happened, right? All these wars have been going on for a long time. I mean, even when you look at Ukraine, right? The Russians invaded 2014. It's actually really interesting. I don't know if you saw, I mean, obviously, you know, when the head of Wagner, Prigozhin, did that weird thing in Russia, right? He actually put out a statement then, and it was really fascinating. It was on his like Telegram channel for Wagner. And he said, hey, we started this war in 2014. We were going back and forth with the Ukrainians. And then his argument was that military leaders in his government kind of pushed the invasion forward, right, for financial gain. He was upset a bunch of his Wagner people were being killed because of the incompetence of how Russia was moving in supplies and whatnot to their actual forces, right? So he even admits, hey, we've been doing this conflict back and forth. The catalyst was, in his opinion, greed, which was interesting. Obviously, the catalyst, I mean, the Israel-Palestine situation has been going on forever. Obviously, the catalyst now to go after and end Hamas is they committed one of the largest terrorist attacks in the world. I mean, they used 3,000 terrorists. I mean, if you just think about how dangerous that is, and I mean, Israel hasn't really been as public about it because I think they want to end Hamas too, but some of those Hamas members trained in Afghanistan. Al-Shabaab supported those Hamas members. Weapons were provided by our terrorists in Libya. So it's actually a huge international problem that's been going on for years, and then it kind of exploded in this big attack. And it's time to do something about it. They probably waited too long to end Hamas, and now it's time, right? And then, Afghanistan was a 20-year war, right? So yeah, they all seem to happen now, but part of the reason they might be happening now, is people feel they can get away with some of these things. The fall of Kabul, I think, revigorate at least the terrorist community that we can do stuff. And then it was really interesting. Remember when Putin was about to invade Ukraine, he did that weird thing where he piled up over 100,000 soldiers at the border to see what the response would be. And then, our president said, oh, it's okay if he takes a little land, right? And everyone's like, what? And Putin's like, really? So, you know what I mean? So some of it too has been like testing, oh, we're going to do it. So it's been very interesting just to watch the big power players decide how they're going to use all these conflicts and take advantage.
What is the U.S.'s role in all of it? Like, what should it be, I guess?
I mean, the U.S. is part of the problem in all of it, right? If we just talk about Israel and Palestine, we fund both sides of the conflict, right? Obviously, it's now being heard about the UN, but if anyone's followed my investigation, for years I've complained about the UN supporting terrorists in Gaza, in Libya, etc. We're funding that, right? And then we obviously fund the Israel side. In Afghanistan, we were funding both sides of the conflict, right? The US's role is almost an enabler and an abettor. Even the Russia stuff, right? So we're funding Ukraine, but then we didn't put enough sanctions on Russia, right? Because remember, we kind of tiptoed on a line, like we don't want to start a nuclear war, so we'll still let Russia do this and let Russia do that and allow this business in Russia and allow people to buy this supply, like a gas or an oil for Russia, if that makes sense. So yeah, we're really good at just kind of like hanging out in the middle and maybe causing a lot of the conflict. And until we figure out like how not to prolong these conflicts, we're just going to keep probably making them worse.
Right. Well, because a lot of people will go out and say that the United States shouldn't really be getting involved, especially in recent, like the past 20 years, right? The US is very, very well known to be a sort of world police, so to speak, right? Which goes around and goes, hey, you can't do that. That's not right. And everybody always calls on the US to go, hey, you can't do that. That's not right. Especially because it's number one superpower in the world, depending on what perspective you have, that's probably changed, but number one superpower in the world. And it's the only one that's a democracy, or at least a relatively free country. So, what's your stance on like something like that?
Yeah, I mean, obviously I work Africa, right? Because I have a Benghazi investigation. So it's probably the greatest example. I mean, I know today's example, right, is the US maybe telling Israel how to respond, which I don't think is our role. But Africa is the best example, right? We go into Africa, we tell them what to do. We say, if you don't do X, we won't give you X. If you don't support this leader and back this leader that we are now king making, right, you're not going to get US support, blah, blah, blah. So that's very dangerous, as you can imagine, because the US does not always pick the good guys. They lots of times get stuck with the corrupt guys, and then it fuels conflict. So Libya is such a good example. So the US made a policy that the US government would not support. His name is General Haftar. He ran the Libyan National Army, and he's the one that's killed about half the terrorists at our attacks. So they kind of put this limit, so American companies couldn't work with them. NATO got involved. NATO said, hey, French companies, whomever, you can't work with them. So as you can imagine, he got to the bottom of the barrel, and he's like, oh, the only people I can work with is Russia, and had to make a deal with Wagner Group, Putin, etc. And we see that all across Africa, right? That those countries can't meet whatever rules the US government set. So they go to Russia, they go to China, and now Russia and China run Africa, and we just collect on what they do, right? We don't compete against Russia and China in Africa. It's like it's their domain now because of our policy.
Right. So, um, again, switching topics, right? So this is related to the agency itself, the CIA. What makes a good or even a great CIA agent?
I mean, I think like a real thing is kind of like scrappy, being able to fail. Because what you do is they send you to this insane environment overseas, right? There's no normal, nothing's normal. Time is not relative like it's the United States, and you fail all the time, right? So you have to like be comfortable with failing. You got to say, here's how I failed, here's why I failed, like here's how maybe we can do it better next time. And so you have to kind of be that kind of personality. Otherwise, as you can imagine, if your ego gets in the way, or you just can't get over like messing up, like you're just never going to be able to roll there, because they give you so much autonomy. You got to do the right thing. You got to make the thing happen. And then you got to do it the safest way and the best way for our country, right? And so you just have to have people with that type of flexibility. I think that's the key, and probably what they look for when they hire.
Well, with multiple people, many different people, right? They'll usually pull military people aside and they'll go, hey, I feel like you might be applicable to this agency, like Bustamante, for example, where they're like, hey, you might be available for other roles in the US government, and all of a sudden you get a call, right? But how might CIA recruitment look like for somebody that's not in the military, that's not directly involved with the US federal government?
Yeah, I mean, the majority of the US CIA recruitment comes out of universities, right? So you apply online, or you go to the information session at your college. They see something in your resume, it might be something like a cultural immersion thing, that there's just some kind of golden nugget, right? One of the things that CIA is known for, and a lot of people don't realize, is there's a lot of Mormons who are case officers. And it's because, as you can imagine, they had to learn a language, and then they had to spend 2 years in a foreign country, right, on their own to make it work, right? And so CIA already knows, hey, if I hire this person, they've already proven effective at this one key item of our organization, right? So they know, so they are looking for certain things, but the majority are either recruited at career fairs, or of course you have to apply online for everybody, just to get in the door.
When it comes to them recruiting at like club fairs or whatever at universities, or job fairs or whatever, do they directly say they're CIA? Do they ever or is it like they pose as something else and like they kind of just see what comes in?
Yeah, I mean, 99% of the time it is CIA. There could be some one-off random thing, and they really have a real operation against some foreigner in this country. You know what I mean? There could just be some weird, this person matters because they're like the niece of some world leader, who knows, right? But if they just want an employee, not an asset, they go as CIA. And the really interesting part is the recruiters are people who do the job every day. They're now just rotating like a year through the recruitment. So it's actually, if you're a student, those are the best people to talk to, right? Because their jobs aren't recruiters, right? Like you get to ask them like, you know, what do you like about the job? What do you don't like about the job? Because they do the job every day. They just now are on this 1 year rotation. So they really know what to look for, right? Because they know who they work with and who does the job well. And so they're actually really well. I really wish other organizations would not have these recruiting departments, right? That they would take people who do the job and go and recruit, because you do get better people that way.
Right. Well, one major criticism of the agency, and this is related to the secrecy part. The major problem that a lot of people have with U.S. intelligence of all kinds, whether it be the CIA, NSA, whatever, is effectively the secrecy behind it, right? What is your response to people that have that complaint against the secrecy of the CIA?
Yeah, I mean, the secrecy is in place, as you can imagine, to protect sources and methods. If something is really not classified, I don't believe in classifying it. And I think most people don't believe in classifying it, because actually, if something's unclassified, you can do more with it, right? I don't have to get approvals. I can just hand it to a foreigner and get stuff done with it. So yeah, the overclassification is wrong, but if you have to protect sources and methods, it matters. I even run my own investigation, right? And I get info all the time that I'm never going to share with the public, because it could reveal my source. I mean, I could put a phone number on a terrorist and just crazy people call them. Like, what benefit is that, right? We lose the phone number then. So there's just some things that there's a reason it's shielded that way, but it's a positive, right? It's so we can continue that collection. Also, like, I have a terrorist in my investigation. I've never told anyone I'm working on him at all, because he doesn't think anyone knows about him, right? So what's the point of telling people and alerting him? It's better to kind of get ahead of him and see what he's doing. And that's kind of what intelligence agencies are doing. And that's really important. That's how you thwart things.
Right. Well, when it comes to things like that get declassified or revealed or leaked even, right? For example, Guantanamo Bay,
Mhm.
right? That's a major controversy, is between the waterboarding and in some cases of innocent people, right? Should Guantanamo Bay still be opened after all this time? Is it right? Is it wrong? Because everybody will go on and say it shouldn't. Well, half the people will say it shouldn't exist because it goes against human rights, which is understandable. But then the other argument is it's not right because these people are terrorists. I'm sorry, it is right because people are terrorists and they don't deserve it, or there's good intelligence to be gained and it's for the greater good and it's justify the means, etc. Where's your stance on that?
Yeah, so I believe you should detain a terrorist like anyone else. Something like Guantanamo Bay, I guess, is fine short term to do detainee debriefings, for example. But I do think a terrorist should go through the justice system, as you can imagine, like anyone else. So the people, let's say they were detained in 2001 and 2002, 2003, whatever, should be going through the justice system, right? I just don't think you should keep people locked up. If you have enough evidence against them, right, in a courtroom, that evidence will put them away in prison, right? That's the way I look at it. So I do think you have to have both. Justice is both pieces, right? You capture them, you put them through a process, you put them in a prison. That's the way I view it. I do think, your piece on the waterboarding, I do think the people waterboarded were all terrorists. I don't think anyone who was accidentally waterboarded. Now, I do think people ended up in Gitmo who weren't terrorists, right? And the assumptions were made, or locals were dishonest about them, for example. So not everybody in Guantanamo Bay I view as a terrorist, but I do think all the persons waterboarded were terrorists. And there was a very small number. I want to say it was maybe 8 persons out of the whole population, in which what was like 500, 600 people went to Gitmo. So just trying to keep that in mind. Like, people think hundreds were waterboarded, and that's just not true. Now, I personally don't believe in, I've never waterboarded, and that's not the way I like to collect information. So it's not really in my ethics, for example. But at the time, it was approved by, like I told you, the National Security Council and the National Security Advisor. And then the people who did it, right, were following the orders of our leaders. And so it's the leaders who have to make those ethical decisions. And then, we kind of get wrapped up in it, and then you kind of blame the lower people, unfortunately, sometimes.
In terms of methods and things that you've done to investigate different people, what advice would you give to current CIA agents and current intelligence agents?
I mean, I just think the thing is always like do the right thing, right? You know, a lot of people say something's a law in the US, it might not be a law overseas. I mean, I think at the end of the day, if you do things right, it's only going to benefit you. As you can imagine, I run an investigation in Libya. It's highly successful because of the person I am, right? They know, I'm ethical. They know I don't believe in collateral damage. They know I believe in not identifying the wrong person, right? Like those things matter when you're building relationships, because people want to build relationships with those type of people. And the US government needs to make these overseas relationships to get their jobs done well.
And continuing on that, were there ever people you worked with that really legitimately impressed you?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, you're always going to meet people that impress you. I had a leader once, like I walked in her office. It was overseas for the first day, and I walk in, and she just took over. It was like a week. And I walk in, and the guy before her had the office all decorated, pictures on the wall, of his little awards. And I go, "Oh, you haven't decorated yet?" And she goes, "I don't have time to decorate. I'm here to work." And I'm like, "Ooh, I'm going to like her." Another example is because you can feel it's like, oh, the kinship. We're like, we're going to get a lot done. Another time is, when I was in Libya, like, obviously all the countries have their CIA heads, the equivalents. And so the French one, he was just, like so impressive. I was like, oh my gosh, he was probably like what all the OSS guys used to be in the past, right? Like he'd spent, I don't know what it was, like 7 years in Algeria, 5 years in Iraq, like just the coolest guy. Like he took every risk imaginable. Like we'd plan stuff and have like 6 security guys, and he'd be like, I'm just going to jump on a plane tomorrow and do it myself. Like it was just to be around those kind of people, obviously is really fascinating to see, and just to see the different people around the world, the different intelligence officers and what they're passionate about and what they're good at. I mean, I think it's just really fascinating to learn from just all different types of people.
Are there any differences in anything, mainly methodology, but are there any major differences in the way that the US does something between, I don't know, France, Russia, Germany will do something?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, some governments are more risk averse. Some have different laws. I mean, I remember there was a time we couldn't pass stuff to the French unless it was so old, because the people were worried they would just do an operation right away and wouldn't have done the legal approvals. One of the big issue is, as you can imagine, that we really care about. Like the little issues we don't, but is if a government does extrajudicial killings, right? So if they go take a guy, he didn't fight back, they have him in detention and kill him. That's kind of the US government's red line, right? So that's kind of where we don't work with foreign governments, or try not to, because it's against obviously the laws of the United States, and we don't want to be involved in that. So that's kind of the big divider. But as you can imagine, I mean, I work Libya, the Russians are in Libya, right? I bump into, we're going after the same targets a lot. I mean, the intelligence agencies, right? You go to DC, probably every other table in there's an intelligence officer sitting there. It's just, we're all over everywhere. We all have different trade craft. We all have different things we're focused on and interested in collecting. And it's just kind of the way of the world.
Right. And on that point, actually, once again, bringing up Bustamante, but in one of his podcasts, he mentioned that it's more likely than not that you've met intelligence officers and not even known it. Is that really true?
Definitely. I mean, especially if you've been in Washington, D.C., you 100% met an intelligence officer, even just on airplanes, right? They travel, people travel around a lot. You interact with people a lot. The end of the day, most intelligence officers have what they're collecting on, right? But they're still going to poke around, right? If they see someone interesting, they're going to start a conversation, right? Like I know when people start conversations with me, especially on social media, right? Like LinkedIn's the best example. I know right away when they're like, oh, they're interested to see, you know, like if they can build a relationship with me because of the intelligence side, you know, and I back off quickly. So yeah, they are constantly putting out feelers and seeing like who'll bite and you know what pathways they should go down.
This is a little bit of a funny question, but if I ask them, is it like if I asked someone, right? If I was in DC, if I was just very like blunt into their face and I said, "Are you working for the CIA?" What would they have to say no? Like, is there certain circumstances where they'd say yes?
Well, you have to remember in the CIA, there's people who aren't undercover, right? If you're like a CIA analyst, you could be a happy hour picking up every girl there is, right? Hey, I'm CIA, because you're not undercover, right? But obviously, if you're a person undercover, you're not going to break cover to like random people. I mean, you're going to have to break cover if it's just like an extreme circumstance, maybe a crime is being committed, maybe a family affair. Like there are reasons you have to break cover, for example, but for the most part, not only you're not supposed to break cover, as you can imagine, even breaking someone's cover is against the law. Remember when Karl Rove broke Valerie Plains is like the greatest example, right? Like that was so inappropriate. So you also just want to protect these people because they're out really doing great things, right? And now for her, really great example, lifelong case officer. Now all those people she met with overseas, even if they were just casual relationships, right? Like when I'm overseas, I make friends with a bunch of people, guys who run the shops, guys who work the like the little checkpoints, you know, but they're not CIA assets. But, you know, think of how dangerous all those people she interacted with were, that everyone then assumed they were a CIA asset. And now all that risk and threat is on them. And obviously that's a problem a lot of people are facing now in Afghanistan and being killed for it.
Right. Well, we even saw recently with the Discord leaks, the Air Force, I think he was part of the Air Force, department somewhere in the Department of Defense, IT guy, I think only a few years older than me too. He was like a kid,
Mm-hmm.
and he basically said, "I'm cool. You don't like if you don't think I'm cool. Here's all these CIA documents." And he basically leaked like this entire network of intelligence, right? Like what like and I think I saw some of the leaks somewhere, and some of it was like um plans to attack Ukraine or like Russia, like stuff like that, right? So what was the failure in intelligence there? Was it just giving way too much trust in somebody that really didn't know what they were doing, or was immature, or had poor impulse control? Like, where could we have prevented that?
Yeah, I believe he was Massachusetts Air National Guard and then kind of had like a detail role where his office was indeed in the Air Force. And the interesting part of his position, like you said, he's IT. IT, and that's what Snowden was, right? IT is almost like behind the scenes, like they can almost get away with printing stuff and it not be known, right? Like if I print stuff, it's all in a ledger and it's like, why stare at him printing all this Ukraine stuff? It's just such an easy signature, right? The IT people know how to get around those things. And so probably the failure then is maybe there needs to be more oversight of these people doing IT. And maybe his age is part of the problem, right? And I think he'd been releasing documents for like a year. The fact that they didn't really get anyone to complain or report on it all that time is fascinating to me if you think about how much we were collecting on Ukraine at the time, that none of that came up. The other problem is if you think about it, he chose what to release, right? And if you just release and see pieces of classified info, you can make inferences that aren't true because you haven't seen it all, right? So like you can see a piece of info and say, oh, the US might be lying about something in Ukraine, but that was like that one snapshot when there's other pieces of info. So I do think too, it led to some misinformation, maybe some conspiracy theories, right or wrong. And that's the problem when you release small pieces of info and people don't have the whole puzzle. It's very, very dangerous.
Right. And actually, on the topic of conspiracy theories, right? I remember there was a comedian I saw recently where he was making a joke. I don't know the guy's name, but he was joking about how there's some people that he doesn't trust, and one of those people that he doesn't trust is people that don't believe in any conspiracy theories. People that are like, "Oh, the government's 100% truthful." I don't know if you've seen the clip.
No, but I
Yeah,
get the general because he's
yeah,
so right.
yeah. And he's like, "I don't trust those people because because and then he makes a joke. He's like, "You believe everything the government tells you, every single word of it. You don't think anything wrong is going on." And then he goes, "I have a son, and I lie to him all the time." You know, but like, would you think he's right in saying that?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like the best people to ask this question to are like the older generation because they lived through the lies of Vietnam, right? So I luckily knew all that young inside. I had a really great history teacher that was always really blunt, right? And it's like, this is what the government said, and this is what happened. So yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, people get lied to. Politicians will twist narratives and do whatever they want. Like, it's really funny. Even when I served overseas, there's these things called congressional delegations, and they would come, and get their couple days in a war zone. But what they would do, which is fascinating, they would tell like the CIA's chief of station, "Oh, we want to meet with your youngest officers, when we come to town," right? Because they want to like do it with the ones who aren't as sharp and will fall for their stuff. And so the funny part is you'd go to these meetings with all these Congress people and their staff, and then they'd ask you some basic question and you answer it. And then they'd say, "So you're saying," and they'd make a summary completely wrong. And like, "Oh, they're just here to like get you to say their point," right? And that's the problem. They pick and choose. They're cherry pickers. That's what politicians do. And so, of course, the government's going to lie to you because they're only choosing what they want to, move forward at that particular time. And they might not view it like you said a lie. It might just be, well, this is a small thing to help move a greater initiative forward for my party or something, So yeah, you have to take everything with a grain of salt.
So it'll be like I don't know, let's just say some guy that's running for president, and he'll ask a former intelligence officer, and he'll say, "Oh, so this happened," and he'll try to get him to answer the question in the way that benefits him, so that
Yeah,
he can
it's
say
not
the
an
source.
opinion or something. You want you to say something negative, or you're not getting the resources you need, or like those kind of things, so he can go back and say, "I was in this war zone, and CIA isn't getting X," and it's like, well, this isn't exactly what I said, right? And I'm like, I've been in the agency like 2 years, so it's just funny watching the games. Like, luckily, I've gotten to see it, and I've worked in Congress, so I have like such a good take. Like, I always like see what's going on, right? And I just wish more people would kind of take it that way, because honestly, a lot of people say stuff on TV and then they go meet at the Capitol Club at night and they discuss it, and they're from different parties and they're actually way closer than you think they are. And, they work together on so many things because they want to keep their two-party system going. So people just need to realize that not everything you see on TV or read in the press is factual.
Right. I mean, I think, but like, at what point, in your opinion, do conspiracy theories go from like reasonable, like that's a reasonable assumption or suspicion to have, to there's no reason that anybody, like flat Earth, for example, or lizard people, right? Like, at what point does it become problematic?
Well, I think anything extreme, it could be conspiracy theory, it could be if you're extreme in a religion, etc. Right? When you wrap yourself and that's your identity, that's where things get dangerous. Even if you're just really extreme on your political beliefs and you're one side only, right? If you wrap yourself in that identity and then you almost become an ideologue, or you know what I mean? Like, oh, it's only this way, it's only my way. I think that's what's dangerous. I think, the majority of Americans are middle of the road. Majority of Americans want to collaborate, work together, figure out solutions together. You get a little bit, I get a little bit. And I think that's kind of the best place for most people to be. And then people way out can be the ones that, are the risk or causing the divisions.
What's the most important thing that you learned in your career?
That you're not the expert. We have a really problem in the government, as you can imagine. Like you said, we have all those documents marked secret, right? And so then you're like, oh no, it's classified. It's got to be right. Oh, we've been collecting for years. We have all the info. And, it wasn't really till I left the CIA and went and did my own investigations, like, oh my gosh, there's so much we didn't know, so much we didn't have, so many people we paid that influenced us, right? Not exactly double agents, but like they only worked for us to give us wrong information, So that's what I learned. It's like, I only know a small percentage of everything, and to say you're the expert on something, I think is a little dangerous.
what about in terms of human nature? What's something that most people might not even realize about human nature?
I mean, I honestly think in human nature, most people are the same, and most people are good, and most people can sense if someone's not good or evil, like dogs do, right? So honestly, I say the majority of people I always meet, like, you know what I mean? They're just people are normal, right? They want to have a good life. They want the next generation, like their children, to have a better life. They want to take care of their family, and they want like a safe community, right? Like it's pretty standard anywhere in the world, and we just need to kind of understand that community level and like love the neighbor again. And I really think on a human level, that's what we have to all get back to.
Was there ever anything that you saw that might have changed your perspective while you were in the CIA?
I mean, as you can imagine, the CIA, you see so many things around the world. Your perspective gets changed all the time. What I'm really bad about right now is because I've seen people live, right? Like I've seen like refugee camp in Baluchistan, Pakistan, right? I have a really hard time empathizing with people. Like on the Nextdoor app is such a great example, right? They'll complain about like the craziest things, like there was a road race and I was trapped in my house, and it's like, hey, I know real people like trapped in their homes. So I have a really hard time with first world problems. Like I just don't have the empathy for it because it's kind of like, people, you're making a big deal. There's a saying we have, and it's called majoring in the minors, right? And Americans do too much of it, right? And so the CIA, anytime we do it, you're majoring in the minors. You're focusing on the small thing that doesn't matter at all. And so that's kind of what I learned at the CIA. Like, focus on the big things, tackle the hard problems. Like, it's better use of your time than wasting it, complaining about the neighbor's dog who poops in your yard. So it's so insignificant.
Do you ever, well, in terms of like human nature and humans being good or bad, right? Is there any traits that maybe the CIA taught you or even that you just learned yourself? Are there any traits that you can see and know whether or not that person is trustworthy, like on a dime? Like, is there anything is there anything somebody could do, or like one thing specifically, or even a list of patterns, right? Or a pattern that they could do that would just make you go, there's something wrong here with that guy or that person?
Yeah, I mean, I think the key thing is most people are like naturally honest about who they are. Even if you're like a trained spy, you have to tell truthful parts about yourself, right? Because if you got to repeat it, you're not going to repeat it right. So when people say something that wasn't consistent with what they said before, or like they said, even just the simplest things, I'm from here, now I'm from here, I study this, now I study this. Like I immediately just like, okay, there's no reason to lie about little basic personal traits about you. And that's kind of what I see. Like small lies make no sense to me. And then that's when I kind of like, my flags go up and I'm like, why is this person like feeding me BS? I mean, if I was young, I would probably have a hard time dating, right? Because people like feed BS all the time, right? Like they're walking dating profiles. But yeah, it's just, that's kind of how we learn the CIA. There has to be truth and honesty in everything because that's how you build trust. And so if someone is constantly not giving that back to you, then they're just not a trustworthy person.
What's the first thing that the CIA teaches you when you get in, right? And also, like when you got hired, because I was looking at your profile, you went from somebody that was working for Disney, right? And then like not even like that many years go by. Next thing you know, you're working as a CIA targeting officer. And I was looking at that, and I'm like, seems like a very big jump between Disney to U.S. intelligence. So, number one, how did that work? But also, when you were there, what did they what did that training look like from what you can reveal?
Yeah, I think people don't realize that CIA people come from all makes and models, right? I was watching, what did she write? Like The Unexpected Spy, that author, and she has an Instagram page and she does a lot of videos. So, I get pulled in, right? And she was doing one the other day where she was saying, hey, the thing that offends me most is the people that say to me, I don't look like someone who worked at the CIA, right? Because the CIA is really just full of normal people. You just wouldn't realize it, right? And then normal people who haven't committed many crimes. So probably working at Disney was probably a plus for me. Gosh, the first thing you learn when you go in, I mean, I think it's just like maybe like you're all a part of a big community, because when you go in, they bring you in with everybody starting at that same time. It could be from any office. And so they're teaching you like, hey, meet these people now, because 10, 15, 20 years from now, right? This is your network. These are the people that are going to matter to you. You need to be cross-functional. You need to have relationships all across the government. When you're overseas, you're going to need to be able to have people you can reach out to help handle things for you. And so I think that's the thing you really learn the CIA is your network is the most important thing to your career.
Is there, and this is probably going to be my last question, but for the United States now and as a nation, what is the most important thing that as a society, as a people, generally at large, a nation, that we need to be doing?
We all just need to work together, right? This is our home. This is our country. We need to care about our safety, our communities. We're just all in this together, like they say, right? We're on the ship together. We either float together, we sink together, and that's the way we got to view it.
All right. I think that's a good place to end off. I'm going to stop the recording. We'll talk a little bit after the show.
Perfect. Thank you.
All right. Yep. Any final comments, thoughts, or last words?
No, I just appreciate you having me on, and good luck with everything.
I appreciate that. All right. I'm going to stop the recording now. All right. All right.